Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to welcome back to the show someone who I've chatted with a couple of times before. She's a senior executive with Accenture. She's a transformational change expert. She's originally from Toronto, Canada, but she now lives in Miami, Florida. She's been a keynote speaker at numerous different events, and she's recently written an article that I found really quite interesting about anchoring your organization in a hybrid scenario, which is something I think a lot of companies have some challenges with. Please welcome Victoria Pelletier. Victoria, welcome to the show. How are you?
Great, Brian. I'm glad to be here again.
Thank you so much. So tell me a little bit about your article on anchoring your organization and the challenges of doing so in a hybrid organization, if you could.
Yeah, the genesis behind this is the conversation I'm having with many executives, as well as, quite frankly, just employees and workers around this, whether it's possible to continue with either a mostly remote or some kind of a blended hybrid environment in maintaining the culture that we had pre-pandemic, the employee engagement, et cetera. So for me, it was, I think of like Elon Musk came out the other day and said, absolutely any office worker needs to be in for 40 hours a week.
Or don't show up again.
Or exactly. And so it's, so for me, the message around when I talk about how do we anchor is recognizing that it's absolutely possible to maintain positive culture, to build employee engagement and have the great kind of work environments that we worked in. It just means a very different thing for leaders in terms of how they show up, how they engage, how they communicate, but also some onus on the employees as well to how they participate in those activities as well.
So what do you think you need to do? What does the leader need to do? One of the things that I found is that having some time where you meet people face to face is critical. It doesn't have to be every day, but once a week, twice a week, you've got to have some sort of face-to-face involvement, and going out to lunch or something like that is really helpful to building group cohesion. Now, can you do that when you're scattered around the world and you only talk on Zoom? I think you can do it if you're only talking on Zoom, 3 or 2 days a week. But I think that having some time in the office where you're actually in a boardroom together is really, really helpful.
Yeah, I agree. In the article, I talked about sort of this power of three and three things. And one of them is around having FaceTime. So I absolutely believe that. And interestingly, I moved to Miami during COVID from New York because I could. And one of the things when actually I was in the process of joining Accenture at that point, and they wanted to know where I was based. And, I was going into a global role, and really their ask was, and this is my recommendation to many companies to consider, was just that you're within a radius of one of the offices for that very reason, Brian. So that when there's occasional all hands meetings and we come together, or for leadership meetings, certainly performance discussions to the extent that you might sit in the same, local office as, someone that reports directly to you. And sometimes just for fun and celebration. And how does that anchor back to like companies' purpose or celebrations when you achieve great success or outcomes, whether it's financially for the business, for clients, or for one another.
Right. Okay. And so that's one of the three. What were the other three?
The other one's about having purpose. This has become much more, or a mission for which we're all working. And so again, if that's solidly in the mind of all of the employees and it's connected ideally to their own personal mission, purpose, values, then that's fantastic. And then we're able to deliver against that regardless of where we work. But what's really important is that companies articulate what that purpose is. It's great. You can't assume just because you make widgets A, B, or C, or deliver this kind of service to these consumers that translates directly into what the purpose or the mission is. So
is this something different and more than like that mission statement that we all saw on the walls a little while ago? Like what do you mean by purpose or mission?
100%. So that mission is kind of like the what we're doing, and the purpose is around why we do it, right? So the connectedness to heart, if you will. Or I actually even kind of go back a little bit to Simon Sinek's start with why. And it's funny because I use that all the time when I talk around my personal story and when I talk around why I think diversity and inclusion is critically important. And how you get there is like starting to understand lived experience, start with the why of people and their purpose for being. And so it's absolutely more than having a great mission and vision statement, which is what we do, why we do, and what we're doing and the outcomes we're expected to drive. And it's much more around, why are we doing it? Why are we showing up here every day? We all have choice right now.
Okay, so I don't know whether it's possible, but can you give me an example of a company why, a company purpose that you really buy into and you think is well crafted and well written?
I should have probably been more prepared for you in asking me that question.
That's okay. I'll give you some time to think about it, and you can come back maybe later on and think about it and tell me. Okay, so that's the two. So you've got this purpose that you've got to have, and it's that you got to have this leader that ends up getting people together, and has this communication, etc. Those are two of the things. What's the third one?
Well, so the first one was around purpose. The next is around the opportunity to have face-to-face get-togethers, celebrations, all of those sorts of things.
Okay.
And the other one's really around communication. So there's a very different level of communication, style of communication and engagement that's required if we're going to operate in a hybrid environment, right? It's a lot easier when we're sitting around that boardroom table or side by side and going out and having lunches and dinners with people to read body language, to just understand and have a sense of the whole person that shows up every day versus this little square box that we stare into. So I think it demands more in terms of how do we engage and create authentic connections with our team in terms of the dialogue, that we have. And also, the water cooler talk and what you hear around the office, in the absence of that, being able to provide more insight into just the general happenings of the organization, the decisions that are being made that might actually have an impact on them or otherwise, or maybe it's around career advancement, hearing about a new project, and that's something that might align with something that, they, were interested in. So the way in which we engage and communicate as leadership, it might not be natural for many. So this becomes this very kind of intentional change in the way we communicate, how much we communicate, and again, kind of the interaction and connectedness and personal dialogue we need to have as well.
Okay, so how do you have that authentic connection and that communication and personal connection in a hybrid environment? Like, do you give up and don't do it on Zoom or on Teams, or can you do it in that virtual world?
You can. I'll tell you one. I'm one who certainly prefers to do it face to face. Even just knowing that I'm a hugger, for example. Like when I meet people, to just embrace them, so they can feel, my compassion and care for them as an individual, or just warmth. Even oftentimes, I'm doing it when I'm meeting people for the first time. I might choose to do that.
Can you hug in today's environment?
Well, you can. So now I'm like super respectful. Again, not everyone is comfortable as I am now. Keep in mind, I'm living in Florida right now. So where lots of people think COVID didn't happen, but so
because you all got infected and recovered. So you had natural immunity.
That's right. So you can. And I think there's a lot of people like me who are, literally and figuratively embracing the embrace. But I'm mindful, so I've met some of my team have come down from other parts of, around the country. And I've only met them over, over Zoom or video conference calls. And so I will seek permission to do that. I do I'm like a hugger. Do you want that? Do you want the handshake, or are we just hands off? So I do think we need to be respectful of that for sure. But going back to that, the original question around it, can you build those authentic connections, by doing it over video calls? You can. For sure. I think what it takes is a couple of different things. And so one, the video fatigue is real, but I realized at some point after a couple of years, so I was kind of cameras off predominantly early days. And then at some point I realized this was not going away anytime soon. So the importance of going on camera and looking in the proverbial whites of one another's eyes through camera, I think is pretty important. The other thing is around, building a relationship. I'm a big networker, and I believe that I build networks from a place of generosity and not greed. I might have hopes of growing business and obtaining new clients, of potentially, attracting and hiring someone, that wants to come over. But I'd rather do that from a place of genuine connection, which means, for me, who's like a type A personality, who would love to dive right into an agenda all the time, it means you actually stop and take a breath at the beginning of each conversation to get to understand, what did you do for the weekend? If I know that they have, children or family, or, maybe an aged parent, I'm going to ask questions about that to, again, build a bridge around things that we either have in common or I know really mean something to them.
We're chatting with Victoria Pelletier. She is a senior executive with Accenture. We're talking about hybrid environments and whether you can actually create connections in them, and what does it take? We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Victoria in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about organizations and creating connections and relationships in a hybrid environment with Victoria Pelletier, who is a senior executive with Accenture. She's a transformational change expert. She's a diversity and inclusion expert. She's been on my show a couple times before talking about several of these issues. She's got a really compelling personal story, which we might delve into a little bit. But she's written a book about hybrid organizations and how to effectively manage in them. One of the things that I got to tell you, because we were talking about sort of face-to-face communications and your hugging scenario. I had a meeting this morning with a guy, and he says the first in-person meeting he's had in 2.5 years, which was amazing. And we walked up, and he put his elbow up, and I put my elbow up, and then he says, "You know what, Brian? Let's shake hands." And he says it's the first person he's shaken hands with in a business setting in 2.5 years.
Wow.
Like that's like, he may have shaken hands with people in a social setting. I don't know. But he said the first handshake I've done in a business setting in 2.5 years. Like, that's amazing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I feel like we've missed out on so much. I think you told your audience that I'm a public speaker as well, and it's so much of it was done virtually over the last couple of years. And I did one in person in March, and I was fortunate to do one yesterday as well that happened to be hosted here in Miami. And I tell you, the difference of being able to stand physically on a stage, look at people in the audience, and see how they react, respond, as I speak. Like, there's nothing like that, then again, doing it and staring into a sea of maybe people have their cameras on, but oftentimes because I'm presenting, I won't even be looking at that. So yeah. I'm glad to be getting back to whatever quasi-normal looks like.
So let me ask you a question. You kept on saying authentic relationships and authentic communications. Tell me why the adjective authentic and how you establish authentic versus whatever the opposite is, inauthentic or transactional or something else. Why the focus on authentic, and how does one establish authenticity?
I use that word because I coach a lot of particularly new hires, and most of my career has been in business to business, and we're selling to other business leaders. And so there's a need to be strategic and intentional about whom we choose to build new relationships with, either the purchaser of services or the influencer. But that said, people do business with people they like, they trust, and therefore they want to do business with. But to like and trust someone means you have to have a relationship that's built upon shared interests, values, need for sharing, for expertise. And again, this notion of trust. And so for me, I get hit up all the time, for example, on LinkedIn. People will send me a connection request and, hey, I love what you're doing. I'd love to, connect with you. And I'm a relatively open connector, so I'll accept it. And then like literally 2 minutes later, they go in for a hardcore sale. They've established no relationship with me. They don't know am I even a buyer for this, et cetera. And so they've gone, and it's a bit of a turnoff for me.
Yep.
Or people who I might have actually worked with, and there's someone I worked with 15 or 20 years ago, and he reached out to me and was like, oh, you're one of the people I most respect, et cetera. I'm sorry I've lost touch. But then instantly it was like, hey, I saw a job at Accenture. Could you? And So for me, when I say it's generosity and not greed, I'd actually rather build a real relationship with someone that's based upon commonality than just my personal interest in receiving something from them, or vice versa.
I guess it's the old adage that people talked about. You got to build your network before you need it. And so that if you're only building your network when you need it, it's too late. And you got to have established those relationships and know those people, so that when you do want to get the job at Accenture, frankly, it's you recommending them rather than me asking you if you even know who I am and can I send you my resume?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So how does a leader create that authentic communication? Like, what do you do? Like, tell me if you were sitting down with me and telling me how I have to, what I have to do if I want to create authentic connections with my employees.
So first, I'd say it needs to come from a genuine place of care and compassion for our employees. And I think what I will tell you is I think a lot of leaders think that there needs to be, or there is a trade-off for around performance and how you performance manage someone with this notion of like care, compassion, and broadly humanity. So I'm going to say there is not, like they're one and the same. And in fact, I think you can achieve significantly better conversation and outcomes and performance by being really authentic and genuine and building these relationships and the type of communication you have.
So what you're saying is some people will only have that care and compassion if people are already performing well?
No, what I find is actually it's almost the opposite, where there's well, actually no, I think, Brian, that's probably it. For people who are performing and you don't need to have a tough conversation with, there's less of a conversation about the day-to-day ongoing performance and more around, broader aspects of one another's life, because you don't need to, talk about sales quotas, and targets, et cetera. And so where I find is there then becomes a little bit of a break with when there's performance challenges, a bit of a fear to build that bridge, that relationship with them, because then you're later going to have to come in and have potentially difficult conversation. There's there was a book written and a talk by a woman named Kim Scott called Radical Candor. And I've actually operated with Radical Candor the majority of my career. And she talks about this around having those radically candid conversation with the people that you work with, and particularly the people you report to, but from a place of care and compassion, wanting them to be successful. So delivering the tough messages that they might not have otherwise heard. But I actually think it's called Radical Candor.
Radical Candor. What a great concept.
Yeah. And
some marriages could use that.
Yeah, no kidding. But I think that that becomes a lot easier to, again, do that if you've had someone's more open to receive that feedback.
Yeah.
Again, if you have a very different type of like relationship. So for me, in every one-on-one conversation I have with my team, before I launch into whatever topics of the day I know that we need to address, agenda items, performance, whatever they have on the agenda, I make time to engage with them around what matters most to them, their spouses, their family, their health, whatever. Again, I make sure I understand, what's important, what are their passions, what are they engaged in? And that was, I will tell you, and as I talk to newer leaders, it was tough initially. I'm A-type personality, as I said. I used to be all business all the time and dive right in, but I never really got to know people because I just quite simply wasn't taking the time and engaging in that conversation.
And can you have those conversations online?
Absolutely. 100%.
Where you ask them about their kids, you ask about their hobbies, you ask them about what's going on in their life. Yeah. You see, I think that one of the problems that we have is that, and my life is just crazy. I've got meeting after meeting after meeting. The schedule is like, and when the thing comes up with 5 minutes left, people really start accelerating to make sure they get it in within the 5 minute time frame. And probably I have more meetings because there's less travel time, so you can actually schedule in a lot more meetings. But what you miss out is, like today, I went to a meeting. I told you I went to a meeting, and this guy took me on a tour of his office, and he showed me all the pictures on his wall of the 40 different golf courses that he has played at, and that he had this ambition to go to the top 100 golf courses in the world. I've known this guy for a year. We've talked about a lot of business stuff. I never knew that he was such an avid golfer. I never knew that he had these pictures on his wall of his office of these different golf courses that he had played. And we ended up having a 5-minute conversation about that and established a rapport. And maybe it was my mistake that I could have and should have done that virtually, but it took the tour of his office and seeing those pictures on the wall before such time as we actually triggered that conversation.
Oh no, but I think, Brian, you're right. There's this, opportunity to observe. I talked about body language, whether it's body language or in this case, something physically in someone's office. So the visible cues help significantly, but I use the words a lot around like strategic intentionality, and whether that's with diversity and inclusion, or in this case, it's around how we, build trusted relationships and how we communicate authentically with one another. Like it's hard. Like, so for me, I actually prefer to do that at the beginning of a conversation, because I think that's almost more important to establish that rapport and trust and start to build the bridge. And then I know I can get into whatever the agenda is.
But the opposite side, I had another call today with people, and it was on video. And the two guys did turn the video on. And it was almost as if we don't want to have a personal conversation. We don't even want you to see our face. And so it's difficult at times to establish that relationship with people.
It is, for sure. Again, it depends on the dynamic. Is it a colleague? Is it, client that you're selling into? And so for me, I have certain rules that I've now created during these times. Like I said, I started at the beginning of COVID, being predominantly, off camera. And that's because I used to be always on conference calls anyways. And actually my former employer, which was IBM, actually they came out with these great kind of 10 rules initially at the start of COVID. And one of them was to respect that people are not always camera ready. And I like that. But my rule has changed now. So if I'm meeting someone for the first time, I am always on camera, always. If it's a one-on-one conversation with one of my team members, we are on camera. If I'm meeting a client, 100%, always on camera. It's a lot of the internal ones that are maybe regular touch point meetings, or like maybe 90 minutes long. For example, I had one of those today where at some point I'm going to go off camera because I just want to like grab a bite of something. So it's harder, and there's more fatigue. Like I find, and I joke with my husband who doesn't do this all day, that sometimes at the end of the day, it might not have been stressful because it was a bunch of calls, but like being camera on and the entire time is actually almost more exhausting than if I were doing some kind of physical work or activity.
Yep. No, I can see that. So you believe that we can create this connection culture in a hybrid environment. We talked about Elon Musk saying you got to come back to the office for 40 hours or don't bother showing up. Goldman Sachs said effectively you got to come back to work. So some of the Manhattan-based banks are back to work, and other people are saying no, hybrid's going to continue forever. And I had a company come in and pitch me that people were, particularly millennials and the current generation are digital nomads, and they're traveling to Miami one week and Atlanta another week and Los Angeles the next week, and they're going to Burning Man the week in between, and they're taking their laptop with them and they're working from wherever they are,
100%.
And they're completely remote. What do you think? Where are we going to be? Are we all going to be back in offices? Are we all going to be remote, or are we all going to be hybrid?
I think hybrid, quite honestly. Yeah, I think physical interaction, touch, all of those things are absolutely necessary. But do we need it for 40 hours plus a week? No. And we need to give flexibility to our employees. And I think it's more and more than like the millennials and the Gen Zs out there now. There's a whole new phrase, I don't know if you've heard, around leisure travel, right? So even just for those who need to hop back on planes for business or choosing to tag on leisure associated with that, the ability to work from anywhere. And so many more of them. I actually am now also leading our travel industry portfolio here at Accenture. So I spend a lot of time with our travel and hospitality clients, and that's a whole new market that they're selling into that they didn't before. And that's because that's the rise empirically, that the data is saying that this is how people are choosing to combination of travel for work with pleasure.
Travel with for work with pleasure.
Yeah, with leisure. It's called leisure now.
Leisure. Never heard of that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, bleisure,
Bleisure.
business and leisure together, bleisure.
Sounds good. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Victoria Pelletier. And we're going to talk about another article that she's recently written about sort of the connection between business and politics. Fascinating topic for lots of it, but particularly for me. Stay with us, everybody. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest today is Victoria Pelletier. She is a senior executive with Accenture. She's a keynote speaker. She's an author. She's a passionate diversity and inclusion leader. She's a networking champion. She's a board director. She's a C-suite transformational leader. She's formerly from Canada, Toronto. She's got a psychology degree from University of Calgary. She's now based in Miami, Florida, South Beach, I think, the place where it's happening. She's had a long and illustrious career with numerous different companies, IBM Consulting, and now with Accenture. And she's recently written another article that I'd like to talk about a little bit called Speech Silence Blowback, Navigating Business and Politics. Victoria, tell us a little bit about the point that you make in this article, if you could.
Yeah, well, now that I've moved to the US, I mean, one of the most curious and interesting things are the political dynamics. And I made my way to Florida by way of New York, much more similar to obviously the Toronto culture and politics. And for me, sitting and watching the news every night and reading the various employee websites, anonymous websites, Fishbowl and Glassdoor and all these sorts of things, what we see is there's an expectation for employees and for consumers to hear how businesses feel about what's happening around them, whether that's around social unrest. And then we start to talk around diversity and inclusion, and are we creating the right kind of environments for our employees? And those, particularly, Black and brown colleagues here in the US, are looking for employers that are going to stand up for those. And so for me, that this article is just around. I mean, I'd always been coached not only on first dates, but certainly in business. One of the things you don't talk about is politics, right? But my talk track around this, as I wrote, is you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, because there's an expectation to, again, going back to purpose and values, for companies to stand up for that, and then some things they need to consider if they're going to.
Okay, so what are some of the things that they need to consider?
Well, I think we really need to look at, standing up around a number of, again, these sort of political hot topics right now. Is it connected with our corporate identity? Right. The purpose, the vision, the mission, right? So you look at years ago, CVS took a stance and said, their tagline is around creating health for, all of their customers. Well, so they stopped selling cigarettes, right? They've taken a stance. So that I use that as it's an older example, but around thinking about a stance on any of these activities, is it connected back to corporate identity, vision, mission, and purpose? So that would be one.
Okay.
The next is silence? Is it really an option? Because consumers and employees will often interpret silence as support for or inaction for. And so you need to, weigh that as well. Others are thinking about, obviously, how is this going to impact our bottom line? Are we going to, is there going to be a whole, market that's no longer going to support our position on this? And how much, wallet share, if you will, or, do we lose? How does it impact our bottom line by taking a stance? Or are you prepared to take that stance at whatever the cost is, when we think about broader sort of, ESG initiatives around doing what's right for the environment in our society, et cetera?
So there's been a lot of attention to ESG, environment, society, or social and governance. And there's been, some people recently that have said, no, government is what should be dealing with ESG, and business should be staying out of ESG. So there's, really two different points of view in that regard. What do you think?
I actually think it's all stakeholders in this. So I think it's government, it's business. and it's private citizens, right? Like I think we all have, a position to take as it relates to ESG. Like we all live, in this world, and we hope that the generations after us will have one to live in. So therefore, government's going to have to mandate and create some regulations for which businesses are going to need to abide by, but ideally they're committed on their own to, again, doing the right thing. And then we as individuals have a voice and we make choices in terms of where we work, the products and services we buy.
Right.
So I think we all have ownership for that, and it should not sit all on government to, attempt to, get us to a better place.
Right. Okay. Well, I tend to agree with you. Okay. So you're in Miami, Florida. So let's talk about something that was in the news, Disney. Your governor, I don't know the exact details of the law, but I think they were effectively something like "Don't Say Gay," so that he restricted schools' ability to talk about actually even the existence of gay people. And I may be going too far, but it was effectively called or described as the "Don't Say Gay" bills that he passed. Disney, obviously very invested in Orlando in Florida, disagreed and came out publicly against that and got a ton of blowback from your governor, even so much so that he was going to take away their tax exempt status or their ability to tax within this municipality that Disney created to create the Walt Disney World. Unlike a lot of corporations, and the example was American Airlines in Atlanta that could leave, or Delta in Atlanta that could leave if they disagreed with what was going on. No way Disney can leave Orlando. So what do you think? Was Disney right or wrong in that regard?
Well, this goes back to, the vision and mission and, of their company and creating, this the happiest place in the world to be. And that includes, gay people, LGBT. And by the way, here we are in Pride Month and, as well, so timely that you would raise that as well. So I think personally, but I'm going to say that, being part of the LGBT community, I have a queer daughter. It's much more personal for me as I say that in my work around diversity and inclusion. So I absolutely think it was the right thing for Disney to take a stance on this. I don't know the stats around how many LGBT, not only employees they have, but, like customers and people who visit there, all the time. And again, obviously Disney is actually headquartered in California, which wouldn't, much more progressive than what you're seeing, here from our, governor down here. So I'm glad they did that. It's just incredibly disappointing to see Governor DeSantis, do what he's doing, in retaliation, quite frankly, for them, standing behind their values, their employees and their customers.
And so what should companies do in that situation? Double down and keep on fighting, or give up and give in to the local governor?
Yeah, I think this goes back to, I said, there's, a few questions that companies need to ask when they're going to weigh in on these type of activities. So is it connected again to who they are, their corporate identity and the culture they have? And in this case, clearly the answer for Disney is yes, right? The next is, is silence an option, or what happens if they remain silent? So are they okay and therefore silently agreeing with the position that, the state has taken? And then what's the impact? So, they've taken a calculated risk, although maybe they didn't know that, DeSantis would go so far as to change their status here, but that it's going to have an impact. And even if it wasn't the tax status, they essentially created their own, if they were given their own kind of like, they operate as their own government entity or whatever, like municipality, they're still going to alienate some, sort of, very right consumers who wouldn't support it anyway. So like, that's a risk that they made. And I'm glad they did it. I'm sure they weighed all of those options before they, came out publicly to take a stance on it. And it's tough. That's why, in this article is like, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, but you have to go through this exercise of asking a series of many questions around who are you as an organization? Who do you want to be? What do you want to stand up for? And what do you want our future and our world to look like?
Now, I I'm not in Florida, so I don't know the answer to this question, but did many other companies jump on the Disney bandwagon or the DeSantis bandwagon? What did the balance of the business community do, if anything?
Oh, there were many companies who took a stand around it. I'll say even like from Accenture, so our North American president and our global CEO, our CHRO, and executive leadership, spent a lot of time, even just internally with our colleagues, saying we do not support this. We support you, particularly when you look at our LGBT like employee resource groups, but more broadly, taking a stand around it, sending communication to the state in terms of their support for the LGBT community and not support for what they're doing, and particularly it's a lot of it's within the school system. And it's funny, they say it's don't say gay, and it's actually not around using the vernacular, but more so around the ability to talk about things like the fact that Tommy or Sue or Jorge, given that we're here in Florida, might actually have two dads, or two moms. Like that's the kind of thing. But they could talk about protecting themselves from a mass shooter and how they need to go under their desk and those sorts of things, but not talking about the reality of the child sitting beside them who might actually have gay parents. And so many have taken a stand on that, from public walks and protests to just emails of support and campaigns, not only to their employees, but in opposition directly to the government.
And do you think that Disney, other than the blowback from DeSantis, has received negative press from right-wing media? Have they lost customers? Have right-wing groups that are supportive of DeSantis refused to go to Walt Disney World? What's the other side of the situation been?
I'm sure there are. I mean, some loss in right wing, and I don't spend a ton of time watching the right-wing news channels.
You don't? You're not
well,
watching Tucker Carlson every night?
Only if I want a bit of a laugh, or sometimes to see an opposition. And now it's funny because I had, a news channel that was, my preferred channel of choice, and I find them slipping a little bit too far to the left. So sometimes I'll do it just to like get a balance between the two. And so there definitely has, a lot of people who are, further right wing who are supporting that. And I do think that there's going to be a subset of consumers who are going to, boycott Disney as a result of the stance that they've taken. But again, I think that was a calculated decision, that they made in doing that, and just being very clear around, the world they, want to live in, the type of culture, community, and inclusive organization and community. I mean, that they're a part of. And so I admire that. And
so I guess what you're saying is sometimes those positions come with a cost, and you got to be prepared to eat that cost. But when it is consistent with your purpose, you should.
Absolutely. And hopefully they'll get some more that are on the left that were like, I'm not really a Disney fan, but I'm going to go and support them. So.
Well, I read the article and I thought it was fantastic. So I really appreciate your writing it, because I do think that not all the time, we don't need to hear business leaders all the time talk about what their politics are, but once in a while, it's helpful to have people in the community talk about what's important to them and stand up for what's important to them on both sides of the issue, because it is something that we should know. And I think business people, business leaders have a responsibility, just like community leaders do, just like frankly, sometimes people complain about athletes when they have a point of view, but I think athletes are people that people look up to, and it's helpful to hear what they have to say on the topics of the day. We're going to take a break with Victoria Pelletier, and we're going to come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. It is Pride Month, and I know you've got your own personal story. So maybe I'll ask you if you're comfortable, Victoria, telling us a little bit about your own personal story in connection with Pride Month.
Right.
Fantastic. We'll be back in 2 minutes with Victoria Pelletier. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We've been chatting tonight with Victoria Pelletier. We started out in the first third of the conversation talking about a paper she wrote about hybrid organizations and can you create authentic connections with people. And she talked about the role of leadership and communication and personal connection and face-to-face. We then turned to an article that she wrote about politics and business and how some political statements should be made by business, and they shouldn't shy away from that. They got to understand the cost of it. They got to understand if it's consistent with their purpose, but that it's something that business and business leaders should be willing to do at the right time. And we spent a little bit of time talking about the Disney example. But it's Pride Month, and you pointed that out in our prior segment. And I know you've got your own personal story about your own experience with being discriminated against and prejudice, and why you are such a strong advocate for diversity and inclusion. Share some of that with us if you could.
Yeah, for sure. It's I came out at age 14 as being bisexual. And although I dated, predominantly men, and that in large part was the fact that I lived in Calgary and I went to a Catholic high school, I wasn't as completely open about it. Thankfully, I had a very supportive family. And when I moved to Toronto, I just found it was completely embraced. And there was such a vibrant LGBT community and support generally for just such diversity across all elements of diversity. And so that's in large part why I started to become so passionate around the work I do in advocating and supporting and creating, great cultures and communities that, welcome everyone's lived experience to the table. And subsequently, since then, I've done that work from a business perspective, but I have 2 children, and one of whom, my younger of the 2, my daughter, is queer. So for her, I started to become much more vocal around it. Even at IBM, I was one of their out executives, of which there were only about 30 globally. And that meant I sat on a web page and everyone knew I wrote articles, when, for example, the Supreme Court, allowed, same sex, or when Biden overturned, the trans military ban and those sorts of things. And I do that because I was fortunate to have a family who supported me when I came out. I was married to a woman for 11 years, now with my husband for almost 9, but not everyone has is fortunate enough to have the kind of experience that I've had or my daughter has had. And so it's why I choose to be vocal, why I choose to be very present and out there publicly around it and offer support, offer my experience, or just offer to listen.
You told me once, I think, that you had some prejudice when you came to dinners and things like that with I presume it was your wife at the time.
I did. It was really, I was quite open. I've always been a believer in, we talked about authenticity and building real relationships. So for me, there was no purpose for me to lie about who my partner was. Not that I didn't sometimes kind of play a pronoun game and just say, oh, my other half or whatever, but certainly for all of my colleagues that I worked with every day, I proudly brought her to our corporate events for, holiday parties and those sorts of things. And I remember, I may, for those who might choose to go and watch this on video, I'm a very, feminine looking woman who most wouldn't think. So there's lots of assumptions that get made. And so there was just complete shock and surprise when I would show up with my female partner, 1. And then, 2, I had a couple of colleagues, and I remember one, he was a fairly devout Mormon, who upon finding out just treated me absolutely horribly. And we were peers, and had to work closely together by the nature of the 2 functions that we were leading within our organization. And it was absolutely horrible for me to show up and, him trying to prevent me from, gaining access to certain clients or this and that. And, I needed to be the bigger person in terms of how I showed up every day, to deal with that and make it not have an impact on my team and on my clients. But it was hard. It was hard. I showed up every day and had to engage with him, regularly, to see the disdain and scorn and some of the often passive aggressive ways he'd also choose to deal with it.
Pride Month is an interesting month, and I think that lots of people can play a role in making Pride Month a more important month. And I want to give you an example and see what you think about it. So, I have a son who is gay, and my brother is. I have one brother who's gay. I have a second cousin who's gay, and for the longest time, he's now passed away. But my best friend was gay, and so I thought that my son was completely knowledgeable about my comfort with his homosexuality. And certainly we talked about it on numerous occasions. However, a couple of years ago, I was in the Pride Parade and I was marching in the PFLAG, the Parents for Lesbian and Gay. I think that's what the PFLAG stands for. And I held up a sign saying, "I'm proud of my gay son." When he saw that sign on social media, he cried and he thanked me. And I said, "Jonathan, why was this so important?" And for him, it was important that I say that I was supportive of him publicly. Doing it privately wasn't enough. He wanted me. Well, I guess it was enough, but he cried because I actually was willing to and did say it publicly and marched in that parade. Do you think it's important for us to publicly say we're proud of our gay children, that we're accepting of gay people, that we're supportive of the LGBT community?
Absolutely. And Brian, you had me tearing up as you told me that story, because I do think it's critically important. I think everyone wants to feel love and acceptance. And as you said, it's a lot easier, like we could do that privately. But I think it feels so much greater for the rest of the world to know that we are loved, appreciated, all those wonderful feelings. And that's what allyship is about. It is about showing up for, even if you might not, for people, you can be an ally without having someone in your immediate family or friend that's part of the community. And it's to demonstrate publicly that you support them, that you accept them and their, I was going to say choices, but for many, it's not actually about choice, right? And so I think when we talk about allyship, that's one of the most important things, is how do we show up publicly, visibly for others, and particularly giving way for some confidence in people who might not have even come out yet, to know that there's people around that will embrace them, support them.
I like your word a lot better. Embrace them. I was going to say accept them, but your word about embrace them is a far more powerful and accurate word. Victoria Pelletier, thank you so much for joining us today, telling us a little bit about virtual hybrid environments and how you create connection, telling us a little bit about how you've got to play a role in business, in politics, when you feel it's consistent with your purpose and you're willing to take that impact, and that it's the right thing to do. And tell us a little bit about how we need to have allyship with the people in the LGBT community, and make sure that people know that we're going to embrace them. Really appreciate it. I think this is an important couple of lessons that you've shared with us today. So thank you very much for that. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at saga960am.ca. You can get all my webcasts, videocasts, podcasts on my website, briancrombie.com. I post my videos on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and my podcasts are on Apple, Audible, and Speakeasy Podcasts. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Victoria. Enjoy South Beach.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.